glass in a compound called CS, formerly known as EA 1779. It can be disseminated as an aerosol or as a fine dust cloud, and it has a swift and pronounced effect on men. So much so that the United States Army Chemical Warfare Laboratories are investigating its possible use as an incapacitating agent. By our definition, an incapacitating agent is one that destroys or greatly reduces a person's ability to perform his duties. It has a large margin of safety between the effective dose and the lethal dose, and it permits complete recovery. When CS is used, exposure to an amount as low as 1 part per million produces almost immediate effects. These usually continue from 5 to 10 minutes, and in some situations, they last for 20 or 25 minutes. Because CS has the characteristics of an incapacitating agent, it has been the subject of study and experimentation. Here is the story of CS.
Under the terms of the Tripartite Standardization Agreement, information about CS was exchanged between the United States and Great Britain, which used CS for riot control. In the chemical warfare laboratories, a program was instituted to determine the feasibility of using CS in a tactical situation. Criteria for the study were based upon experiments then being conducted in a dynamic aerosol exposure chamber, a structure designed to study effects of proposed compounds. Typical is the experience of these Army volunteers who entered the chamber knowing they would be subjected to an aerosol of a new compound, but not knowing what the effects would be. The dose selected for this first test was at the minimal level, based on British findings that CS is effective in extremely low concentrations. Careful control of these chamber tests resulted in a dose of only 2 parts per million. Even so, the effects were apparent almost at once. Although told to remain in the chamber as long as they could, in just 27 seconds, the volunteers left the chamber. They experienced typical symptoms, including eye irritation, lacrimation, sneezing, coughing, and labored breathing. With preliminary data from these chamber tests in hand, field trials were scheduled under stimulated tactical situations. In the first trial, troops from several scattered Army units were exposed to the compound. They were instructed to put on protective masks when they felt it was necessary. Experimental grenades containing 1/4 pound of agent combined with a burning mixture were in place for static firing to simulate preparatory fires of an attacking force. These grenades have an emission time of 20 to 25 seconds. Upon firing the grenades, what appears to be a dense cloud of agent was formed, but only 1/5 of the cloud was actually CS. Highest concentrations achieved were 2 to 3 10,000ths of 1% in air. As the agent cloud reached the defensive position, some of the men succeeded in putting on their masks, but others were completely incapable of doing so because the effects of the agent were so rapid and severe. The obscuring effect might be minimized by disseminating the agent from other types of munitions rather than from burning grenades. A masked observer was assigned to each volunteer to record his reactions and to assist him in case he was overcome by the agent. Effects of the agent, even in extremely low concentrations, are so rapid and so acutely painful that a man becomes obsessed with an overpowering desire to remove his mask and escape from the cloud. Even then, some men collapse on the ground or wander around in a state of helplessness. In this test, every one of the volunteers abandoned his position. The agent produced severe irritation of the eyes, nose, throat, and lungs. Among the symptoms were the same convulsive coughing, heavy labored breathing, and searing chest pains experienced by the wind tunnel volunteers. Conspicuous salivation occurred. The eyes lacrimated and closed involuntarily, and they could be opened only with great difficulty. In severe cases, nausea and vomiting occurred. Frustrating as these effects are, the exposed individual recovers in from 5 to 15 minutes after he gets into an atmosphere of fresh air. A feeling of exhaustion and weakness may persist for a few hours after the worst of the effects have worn off. Although effective in very low concentrations, exposure to heavy doses of the agent does not result in permanent injury to the individual. The rapidity with which this incapacitating agent can temporarily prostrate a man demonstrates its effectiveness for riot control and gives rise to serious considerations that it might have potential uses in combat operations. The potential was tested in another field trial using trained troops from the 3rd Battalion, 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment in a simulated tactical situation. The same type of burning grenades was functioned in the path of the attackers. The concentration of agent was the same, 2 to 3 10,000ths of 1%. One man ran through the first cloud before he felt the effects of CS. However, before passing through the second cloud, he had lost his impetus. Effects varied depending upon the dosage received by each man. The attacking group of this well-trained Army unit was demoralized by CS. Some of the men lost their helmets, rifles, and masks in their confusion. Others reported they had put on protective masks, but the constriction in their chests prevented them from clearing the masks properly. They were forced to remove the masks in order to breathe. In about 10 minutes, the squad had recovered completely. However, none of those affected volunteered to repeat the test. There are several methods of effective dissemination made possible by adapting existing materiel. The burning type grenade already has been demonstrated. A new kind of bursting grenade made of plastic material so that the fragments are non-lethal also can be effective in dispersing a dust cloud of CS, which has a pronounced effect on the eye.
The nerve agent is invisible. The invisible cloud has now reached the goat. In a short period of time, it will be possible to see its effect. The visible symptom here is a loss of coordination. The goat's muscles begin twitching. The trembling and twitching of the animal's muscles will soon become full-scale convulsions. When this happens, breathing becomes impaired, and the goat will die from paralysis of the muscles that control breathing.
Can tonight reveal the true
total time,
extent of germ
less than
warfare
2 minutes.
tests carried out in the southwest. Government documents show much of North and South Devon and parts of Somerset were used for experiments similar to those conducted off the Dorset coast during the 1960s.
An independent inquiry has already been ordered into the Dorset trials to determine whether or not they've affected people's health. In a few minutes, we'll be speaking exclusively to the man in charge of this inquiry. But first, our environment correspondent Simon Hall has this special report, which includes film of the trials never previously seen on television.
The germ warfare trials carried out in the 1960s and 70s were highly secret. This previously unreleased film of the experiments as they happened. Their existence was revealed last year when secret documents were declassified. They were thought to be carried out mainly in Dorset. A spotlight investigation has, though, discovered they were far more widespread than was previously thought, taking in parts of Somerset and much of Devon.
This is the easternmost tip of Torbay. Out there is Lyme Bay, and it was there that a ship made a series of passes spraying a gas which contained the germs. Now, the idea was to see how the germs behaved and survived as they passed over land, and so the prevailing wind conditions were chosen so that the germs were blown over here across the coastline and into areas such as South Devon.
There were 6 runs between October 1964 and May 1965. The lines indicate the ship's tracks. Where the germs were blown to can be seen from the sampling points that were set up. They range from southwest of Torquay to just outside Lyme Regis. The news has caused concern.
Surprised that it happened, horror that it could have happened, and a hope that it's not ever going to happen again.
What would you like to see done about what's happened?
Well, I think the members of Torbay Council will want to raise it with our local MPs. I think at the very least some questions to be asked in the House of Commons.
The experiments were not confined to South Devon. Other trials tested how the germs would survive in different conditions in different areas. These were based not on releasing a gas, but instead on exposing a narrow thread of material coated with E. coli to the air. These tests were carried out in January 1967. The threads were exposed first from a ship just off Ilfracombe, then on 5 other sites running through Somerset down to the sea off Dorset.
I think people of Ilfracombe, when they come to hear of this, will be concerned. For instance, I was in my 20s at this time, in the 60s, and I was just getting married, starting up a family. They'll be worried, will this have any implications on their health or the health of their children?
Concerns have been raised that the tests may have harmed people's health. In East Lulworth, in Dorset, 21 families say they have experienced miscarriages and children being born handicapped and with other health problems. Robin Southey was one of the scientists who carried out the experiments. His widow, Anne Reed, is pressing the government for a full investigation into the trials. For Robin Southey died at the age of 33 from a rare disease which led to a perforated stomach. His immune system was said to be almost ineffective. The couple had 2 sons. One died at 17 from a brain tumour. The other suffers serious health problems. Their daughter is healthy.
I was devastated. We had 3 little children. And with hindsight, there were questions I should have asked. But what else do you do when you've got 3 little children waiting at home and you have to go home and say, sorry, Daddy isn't coming home, he isn't better. And our lives were turned upside down.
The government has always maintained the trials were safe. It says the germs used were naturally occurring and were treated to make sure they could not be harmful. It's a view supported by many experts.
Well, health experts with the authority are looking all the time at the community and its health. And we've seen no evidence to date to identify any clusters of leukemia, any unusual health conditions which some people have said have been associated with these tests.
The experiments were carried out at the height of the Cold War. They were designed to assess Britain's vulnerability to a biological attack and to work on methods of defence. The fear, though, is whether some of the people the trials were intended to protect may in fact have been harmed by them. That's a question that should be answered within the next year, for the government has said an independent safety review of the experiments will be carried out by a leading microbiologist.
We've been told today that the man leading that independent inquiry into the germ warfare trials is Professor Brian Spratt, who's a microbiologist at Oxford University. Earlier, I asked him if he could reassure people that the inquiry would really have the muscle and the will to get to the truth.
Well, I believe so. I'm an independent academic microbiologist. I have no links with the Ministry of Defence. I wasn't chosen by the Ministry of Defence, so I think my independence is assured. I shall be reading a large amount of technical information about the trials that took place in the 60s and 70s, and I shall be consulting widely, not only with medical colleagues and with perhaps people that were actually involved in the trials from Porton Down, as it was then called. I should also be asking for written presentations from people in the south of England that want to give me presentations. I should be coming down to the south of England and talking to anybody who wants to talk to me. So I hope it'll be a wide-ranging and open and fair analysis of the safety issues of those trials.
Now, secrecy and delays with information have prompted much concern in the past. How swift and how open can this inquiry now be?
Well, I've got access to all of the files that are available, and I should be receiving those very shortly from the Ministry of Defence. And I've been asked to come to some conclusions and write a report within a time frame of 6 to 12 months, and I hope it'll be closer to 6 than to 12.
And the surprising information today that the trials weren't just in the Dorset area but beyond. Can you examine the other trials that we're now hearing about as part of your inquiry too?
Well, I can't give you a categorical answer to that. As I understand it, some of the paperwork that I will receive from the Ministry of Defence do include trials in the southwest of England, and if that is so, then certainly I'll look at those papers and make a judgment on them.
Professor, thank you.
Thank you.
And if you'd like to discuss the germ warfare trials, you can call your BBC local radio phone in. The number to call is 0645 22
was exposed to enormous quantities of chemicals in 1959. Families in East Lulworth are already demanding a public inquiry into germ warfare tests carried out in the 60s. Now documents show chemicals were dumped by aircraft over Dorset in quantities that were up to 1,000 times greater than the rest of the country. Our environment correspondent Simon Hall has this exclusive report.
The aim of the airborne tests was the same as those carried out from ships, to examine how vulnerable Britain was to a germ warfare attack. This, though, is the first time a chemical known to be toxic was used, zinc cadmium sulfide. Scientists say the cadmium is the most worrying component. It is carcinogenic, and studies have shown it can cause birth defects in rats. It's unclear if it could have the same effect in humans.
Its health effects include damage to the lungs, kidneys, and to the liver, and also cancer of the lungs and prostate have been found.
The test was carried out in August 1959. A plane flew above the North Sea, then along the English Channel, spraying the chemical. Typical numbers of particles detected were 0, 1, 8, 12, and a maximum of 38. But when the plane reached the end of its track, something happened. That resulted in Dorchester sampling 4,315 particles. There was no sample point at East Lulworth, but it lies directly in the chemical's path. The experimental reports give no indication as to why such high levels were recorded at Dorchester, but scientists I've spoken to believe one of two things happened. Either something went wrong and a large amount of the chemical was released accidentally, or, being the end of the experiment, the remaining chemical was deliberately discarded.
Now, it has emerged that no scientists are to be prosecuted over the controversial experiments on human volunteers at the Porton Down chemical warfare establishment. The Crown Prosecution Service says a review carried out after an inquest on a volunteer who died there shows there is insufficient evidence to bring charges. BBC South Today's Chris Conover reports.
An inquest into the death of Ronald Madison in a gas chamber at Porton Down half a century ago resulted in a verdict of unlawful killing, resulting in no prosecutions. It's been decided there's insufficient evidence to charge any of the surviving scientists. Some of the veterans say they're not entirely surprised, but there's still resentment about the lack of top-level acknowledgement of what happened to them.
The thing that horrifies me is the complete lack of any sort of condemnation for the people that really matter, that is, MOD and people like them. And nothing is ever said to bolster our confidence that they've got the system right.
But this is not the end of the affair. 500 veterans of the guinea pig experiments are pursuing personal claims, hoping to win compensation for conditions they believe they're suffering now as a result of what they experienced then. The veterans are aging and some are no longer around, but the campaign is continuing. Chris Conybeare for BBC South Today.
And good evening. Thanks for joining us on this Saturday. I'm Tom Yamas. And tonight, President Trump is calling the military action he ordered on Syria a perfectly executed strike. It was a powerful show of force. More than 100 missiles launched from ships and planes. The U.S., France, and the U.K. all taking part. Syria taking defensive action. This image of one of its surface-to-air missiles streaking over the Damascus skyline. But the U.S. claims every missile hit its mark, crippling Syria's chemical weapons program. And tonight, a new warning from the U.S. if Syria attempts another chemical attack on its own people. ABC's chief global affairs correspondent Martha Raddatz starts us off.
A dramatic barrage designed to send an unmistakable message. The U.S., Britain, France unleashing more than 100 missiles from the air and sea. This Tomahawk launched from a U.S. submarine in the Mediterranean. The missile emerging from under the water, blasting into the sky, powerful and on target.
I'd use 3 words to describe this operation: precise, overwhelming, and effective.
The backbone of the arsenal, 60 Tomahawk cruise missiles launched from destroyers. When the dust cleared and dawn broke, a scientific research center north of Damascus, a smoking ruin. The U.S. military says it was one of 3 chemical weapons facilities destroyed.
It's going to have a significant effect on them, so I think the words cripple and degrade are good, accurate words.
The strike came 1 week after that Syrian chemical assault on Douma, and those images of families and children gasping for breath. Images that outraged the president.
These are not the actions of a man. They are crimes of a monster instead.
This was the second time President Trump has ordered a missile strike against Assad for using chemical weapons on his own people. And this time, Trump doubled down, sending nearly twice as many missiles. Today, UN Ambassador Nikki Haley issuing a stern warning.
If the Syrian regime uses this poisonous gas again, the United States is locked and loaded. When our president draws a red line, our president enforces the red line.
Now the president taking a victory lap, tweeting a perfectly executed strike last night. Thank you to France and the United Kingdom. Could not have had a better result. Mission accomplished.
So
that mission accomplished, drawing immediate comparisons to President George W. Bush's
a new police cordon at a supermarket in Salisbury tonight. This an investigation with some unlikely locations, but a predictable suspect. After Litvinenko, it took a decade for the government to get to this point.
Order.
Statement, the Prime Minister.
But now, 8 days on, Theresa May came to the Commons. In her hands, one of the most remarkable statements she's delivered as Prime Minister. And with every moment on her feet, the diplomatic tension rising.
It is now clear that Mr. Skripal and his daughter were poisoned with a military-grade nerve agent of a type developed by Russia. This is part of a group of nerve agents known as Novichok.
It's for investigators to establish who had the means, the motive, the opportunity to launch a poison attack. The Prime Minister said they'd come to a conclusion.
The government has concluded that it is highly likely that Russia was responsible for the act against Sergei and Yulia Skripal.
The attack on the former spy and his daughter also left a police officer seriously ill. The Prime Minister said if Russia was not responsible, it had somehow lost control of its nerve agent, and it has until Wednesday to explain.
Should there be no credible response, we will conclude that this action amounts to an unlawful use of force by the Russian state against the United Kingdom. And I will come back to this House and set out the full range of measures that we will take in response.
Novichok is the name for a family of nerve agents said to be the most deadly ever created. It was developed by the Soviet Union in the 1970s and 80s. It's believed to be up to 8 times more potent than the VX nerve agent and can be administered as an ultra-fine powder. When inhaled or absorbed into the skin, it causes suffocation and heart failure.
It is just possible that they've lost some of it, but if they have, I mean, that is hugely serious, and I would have thought unlikely, because the Russians would protect this stuff, because in essence, they didn't declare it, as they should have done, and Mrs May has also said the organisation of the prohibition of weapons, chemical weapons, should be called in immediately to investigate, and I think she's absolutely right.
The British government has threatened to respond to what happened here, but it must know that Russia's enthusiasm for retaliation will be greater. If this theory is correct, this was a row
were chosen for the trials because the area is close to Portland Naval Base, and onshore winds can be obtained with any wind direction from 100 degrees through south to 300 degrees. A suitable control site was found at Fleet, which is only 6 miles from the naval base and 60 miles from Portland. The method of conducting the trials was for a small ship to lay a crosswind line source of bacteria in the path of an onshore wind. As the cloud drifted inland and over the surrounding countryside, it was sampled by mobile sampling stations. The line source was between 5 and 20 miles long, and it was sampled at distances of up to 40 miles downwind. The trials were controlled by radio from the control site, and, if necessary, through a radio relay station suitably positioned on a high hill. At the end of the trials, the samples were brought back to the mobile laboratory at the control site for assessment. Of particular interest is the viability of the organisms contained in particles capable of penetrating into the trachea and lung. That is, those organisms in particles less than 6 microns in size. At the first station, the viability of organisms in particles less than 6 microns in diameter was 89%. At the second, 96%. At the third, 74%. At the fourth, 59%. And at the fifth, 22%. Whilst these trials were designed for specific research purposes, they demonstrated in a striking way the feasibility of small-scale biological warfare. An appreciable dose of viable bacteria was achieved over an area greater than 1,000 square miles by the release of only 120 gallons of suspension.